I'm Joe Lample. When I created Growing a Greener World, I had one goal: to tell stories of everyday people, innovators, entrepreneurs, forward-thinking leaders who are all, in ways both big and small, dedicated to organic gardening and farming, lightening our footprint, conserving vital resources, protecting natural habitats, making a tangible difference for us all. They're real, they're passionate, they're all around us. They're the game changers who are literally growing a greener world and inspiring the rest of us to do the same. Growing a Greener World, it's more than a movement, it's our mission. Part of what makes a good garden great is all the attention to detail, from the striking plant combinations, to knowing what colors work best together, even down to tidy pathways and weedless beds. The award-winning gardens here at the Mohonk Mountain House, 90 miles north of New York City, do that in spades. Now it's beautiful here to be sure, with about 1,300 acres of trees, shrubs, seasonal color, and impeccably maintained grounds, and a small army of workers to keep it that way. But what about our own house? Without a professional staff to do the work, how can we find ways to keep our gardens and landscapes looking good while minimizing or even eliminating the inputs typically used to make them so? Well, a good place to start is taking the advice of Dr. Reich. He's a former plant and soil researcher with the USDA, an assistant professor of horticulture, author and lecturer, and longtime avid gardener, who happens to live just down the mountain from here. So with a guy as smart and experienced as Lee about gardening, it's no surprise that he's written several books on the subject, including one on weedless gardening. That's right, weedless gardening. Now, just to be perfectly clear, we're not talking about weed-free gardening here, but we are talking about gardening with a lot less weeds. And this is not a book topic you see every day, so it certainly got our attention, and it's a big reason why we're here today.
I came to weedless gardening because I was not a gardener from my youth. I sort of started gardening at a certain point in my life, and I noticed that when everybody seemed to be fixated on weeds. And then I read a book, actually one of the best books I read was called Plowman's Folly. It was written in the 1940s, and it really was one of the first books to promote not tilling the soil as a way to help control weeds. And that sort of got me started on it.
All right, I like this already, this use of the arborist wood chips, a great free source of mulch, and it feels really good underfoot too. Okay, so here's the famous weedless garden. You know I'm looking for weeds, don't you?
Yeah, well, let's see if I can find one.
Yeah, seriously.
Oh, I got one.
One.
A little oak tree.
It's a tree. All right, so the first question, we all want to know, how much time do you actually spend every week weeding in here?
So I probably spend, well, usually if I'm walking through the garden, I'll pull weeds if I see it. But, you know, to deliberately come out and do some weeding, maybe like 3 to 5 minutes a week.
In a garden of this size, 3 to 5 minutes a week. Lee has developed a 4-step system for a weedless garden that's sure to work no matter where you live.
So the first thing I did is I abandoned tillage. I have not tilled this ground for 30 years.
No tilling, so less work.
Less work.
Okay, so why no tilling? Because that goes against conventional wisdom. We think we need to till to mix in the organic matter deeper down into the roots where the roots are and all of that. Not true.
Yeah, what happens is buried in with every soil are many weed seeds, and they're just waiting for light and air to germinate. Yeah. So when you till the soil, basically you're giving them light and air, and it's just like sowing, although you're killing weeds maybe that are already growing, you're basically sowing new weed seeds. And you can see if you dig down in the soil, as I said, it hasn't been tilled for 30 years.
So this is 30 years of just natural buildup. You can just see it's nice,
soft soil. Obviously, it's not hard to dig into.
Wow. This is what I call TV soil. where you can actually plunge your arm into the soil effortlessly, like up to your elbow, which is about where we're at right now, Lee, of just beautiful soil building. It's exactly what we're after.
Yeah, and by not tilling also, the soil retains this natural horizonation, you know, very high organic matter on top, a lot of aeration, a lot of biological activity, and it changes with depth, just as in nature. The other thing that it does is it maintains a good soil structure. When you till the soil, you really can break up the soil structure, so the soils become almost like crystalline structure, which is really good for moving air and water in the soil. And then also you maintain very high organic matter levels, because basically when you till a soil, you're adding a lot of oxygen into the soil, which really burns up organic matter. So this soil has a very high organic matter level. I've had it tested, and it's 15% organic matter.
Now that may not sound like a lot, but that is a lot, because native soils typically have anywhere from 0 to 5% if you're lucky, right?
Right, right. And the other thing about not tilling the soil is you don't disrupt earthworms, fungi. They all get to do their thing in the soil. So I think I came to appreciate soil just because it seems like the fundamental thing. It's sort of like a house built on a good foundation. You start with the soil, and then you work up from there. So I feel like I was really lucky to have been trained in soil before horticulture.
By not tilling, don't feel like you're missing out on getting nutrients deep into the soil. Just as in nature, most nutrients are deposited in the surface layer, where most plants have the majority of their roots.
It's just fascinating. There's what's contained in the soil as far as biologically, nutritionally, physically, it all comes together. And if you do it right, it makes for good, healthy plant growth.
The way around not having to till is to make sure the areas designated for growing never become compacted.
So what I did to avoid that problem is I set up the garden in permanent areas for planting and permanent areas for walking.
Okay, so there's step 2. Those shall always remain separate.
Correct.
Okay.
And then the nice thing about that is you can see the plants are very packed into this bed. It shades the weeds so that you get less weed growth. There will be weeds coming up, but they get shaded. And you can put a lot of different kinds of plants into a single bed. So instead of having, say, lettuce plants with 18 inches between the rows, as you might read on a seed packet, I have 4 rows of plants here. I have lettuce, radishes, lettuce, arugula, and they only have a few inches between each row because I can do everything from the outside of the bed. And then another advantage is I can put other plants in there. For instance, there's a hill of corn, another hill of corn, another hill of corn. All these hills of corn, they're just starting out now, and by the time they start to get a little bigger, the lettuce and the arugula, they're really at the end. They're going to come out, and then this will be a corn bed.
Yep, and I like the point that you made, because this is an important one to reiterate, is the fact that even in a weedless garden, you're still going to get weed seeds coming in from birds and from the air and from people's feet, for example. But by having a bed so intensively planted like this, you are shading out more of the possibility of those seeds germinating just because they get light.
Right, and you get more production out of the bed. And you know, one other thing about the beds is most conventional vegetable gardens just an expanse of dirt when they don't have plants in them. This is sort of nice because you can have different designs. This just happens to be a rectangle, but you can have different shapes. And then even when there's no plants in it, you know, you sort of have a little parterre, as it's like a French garden, with a design on the ground. So it seems to me like a win-win situation. You have these beds and you get a lot of production. It looks nice.
And no weeds.
Right.
What more could you want?
Right.
Now, no matter how diligent you are in fighting weeds, they'll still find their way into your garden and landscape through a number of different ways. But by applying a thick layer of mulch on your pathways, it will help in stopping those weeds from germinating.
In the vegetable beds, I use compost because compost feeds the plants besides snuffing out weeds, and it also has other benefits to the plants. It keeps moisture in the soil, and feeds the biotic life.
So this is step number 3 then. We're covering our planting areas with organic matter, and in your case, compost. Now you make a lot of compost here. How much are you covering those beds with each time?
Well, I like to put in a minimum of 1 inch of compost, 1 inch depth. And the reason for that is because I made this computation that 1 inch depth of compost will feed all my vegetable plants, even when they're intensively planted like this, for a whole season.
Good to know.
And I could use more, but 1 inch is the minimum.
Yeah, because then you have a lot left over for other types and other places that you need it. Now, when do you do this? How often?
Typically, I like to do it in the fall because this makes one less thing for me to do in the spring. So I try and do it in the fall. But for instance, this bed looks like the plants look a little peaked. So I'm going to add some compost to this bed. You know, as you said, I have plenty of compost, so I'll just put some down, and can't hurt to add more compost.
Right. So supplemental feeding, in our case, it's mid-June.
Right.
Never hurts.
Right.
So 3 down, 4 to go, and our steps to having a weedless garden, and I know the 4th has to do with watering.
You're right, Joe. This is a drip irrigation, and drip irrigation cuts down weeds because, first of all, it doesn't spread. It just drips the water right near the plants or in the bed and doesn't spread water in the paths, so you don't waste water there and you're not promoting weed growth in the paths. And when the water goes down into the ground by each drip tube, it spreads out by capillary action. And this combines with the not tilling the soil, so you maintain these capillary channels, so the water goes sideways and gets to all these plants.
It's just like wicking then. It's
right,
a lot of people think
exactly.
when the water comes out, it goes straight down, and that's like the only place it's going. But capillary action is pulling it sideways.
Right, so you do not have to have, the pipe does not have to be next to each plant. It can be in the middle, and it'll spread the width of this bed underground, and it won't promote weed growth on the surface or on the paths.
That's assuming also that you have really good soil too that allows for this.
And not tilling the soil. This maintains the capillary channels. So this drip irrigation tubing has these holes. This particular tubing has holes every 6 inches here. And these aren't just holes punched in the tubes. These are actually engineered orifices.
So engineered orifices.
Yeah.
That's very fancy. What's the difference?
So they are somewhat self-cleaning, so if any debris happens to get in the line, they'll flush it out. And the other thing is they'll be pretty consistent in its output throughout the length of the line. So if there's changes in pressure, incoming pressure, it'll be consistent. At the end will be pretty much the same as the beginning, changes in elevation. So it's very consistent, and you know how much water you're getting out here. And you just lay the tubing down along the row. What I like to do is, it's easy to automate this. So I have it set on a timer at the spigot, and this goes on a total of half an hour every day of the week, which sounds like a lot, but it's just dripping out.
Right.
And I like to spread out, depending on the timer. My timer can go on and off 6 times a day, so I like to spread it out through the day because plants use water through the day. So I have it go on 5 minutes each time for 6 times a day.
Wow.
If I had a timer that just went on twice a day, I'd do it 15 minutes each time, twice a day. And it's really perfect. It saves water, typically 60% over sprinkling, which would be watering paths and everywhere. The plant leaves stay dry, so you get less diseases, and the plants grow really well, and you get less weeds.
It's always good to have less weeds, which is why we're here.
Right.
So as we now know, even in a weedless garden, we still have weeds, just fewer over time. And one of the ways we reduce that population is to break the life cycle by preventing the weeds from going to seed or into dormancy where they come back bigger and stronger even next year. And as an organic gardener, I always look for ways to fight those weeds without herbicides. So the idea of using the heat of a concentrated flame really sounds like a good idea, especially on a big property like this. So this option, using the heat of concentrated flame, is a convenient and effective way to take on those weeds without chemicals, especially over a large area of property. The devices come in various styles, from this backpack model for covering larger areas down to handheld models for smaller jobs. The idea is to simply apply the flame briefly to the weed. You're not trying to catch the weed on fire. It's simply the brief exposure of the intense heat that breaks down the cell structure of the weed, rendering it unable to sustain itself and eventually dies. Now the caveat is that some weeds die more quickly than others. Weeds that tend to have roots just around the surface often die with only one hit of the flame. But tap-rooted weeds can take several applications over a few weeks to deplete their energy. But if you stay at it, a flame weeder can be an effective and chemical-free way to enjoy a garden and landscape with less weeds, no matter where you live. Now, it's one thing to have a weedless garden, but having a plantless garden, now that's an entirely different thing, but it can easily happen if you're not careful. Herbicides are the most common method for killing weeds. Some products are non-selective, meaning they'll kill just about anything the chemical comes in contact with, including your beloved plants. Others are considered selective. They can be applied over grass or farm fields, for example, and it kills the broadleaf weeds, but it doesn't harm the grass at all. That makes products like this a popular choice with many farmers that grow grass for horses and livestock grazing or produce hay for resale, since it's reported to be safe for the animals and the product doesn't break down quickly either. So what does that have to do with you and me as gardeners? Well, if you're like me and one of the many people that adds manure to your garden beds, these days you need to be really careful because there's a good chance that it came from the animals that ate the grass or the hay that came from the fields that was sprayed with a persistent herbicide. Historically, adding manure has been a safe, time-tested organic option for providing nutrients and improving soil quality at the same time. But with the increased use of persistent herbicides in recent years, even composted manure containing those herbicides can remain active and so potent that it survives for months to several years after it's consumed by the animal in the form of grass or hay. The unintended consequence of adding manure to our gardens that contains even small amounts of this herbicide is a very active chemical that will kill or stunt many of the plants in your garden, not only in the first season you add the manure, but potentially for several seasons after that. And that's what happened to me. Some of the manure that I had been composting from our own horses came from hay that was provided by a farmer that sprayed his fields with that persistent herbicide. And unfortunately, some of that manure made its way into these garden beds. The mistake isn't realized until you see your new plants displaying twisted or distorted leaves, or in other cases, stunted growth. But by then, you only have two choices. You can dig it all out and start over with clean, untainted soil, or you can wait it out. But that can take from several months to several years. The speed at which the persistent herbicides become deactivated is based on the amount of heat, light, moisture, and microbial activity, which is basically how many beneficial microbes are eating and breaking down the chemicals in the soil. The more the good guys you have, the faster the deactivation process. So if it's too much to remove all the soil and start over, then turn the beds often to add more air and light, which will increase the good microbe population, keeping the soil moist but not wet, and plant what you can, like cover crops to keep the soil working and active. And the addition of more clean compost along the way will introduce more good soil microbes to help break down the bad guys quicker. Now the good news is you can find out ahead of time if any of the manure that you're considering adding to your garden soil contains any of the persistent herbicides by testing it yourself, and it's easy to do. You'll need a control sample, so fill several containers with high-quality store-bought garden soil and plant seeds in each container. Beans work well for this because they're fast-growing and sensitive to the herbicide. In an equal amount of other containers, fill each with a mix of half of the purchased garden soil and half of the composted manure. This grouping will serve as our suspect group. Plant these seeds just as you did with the control group. Make sure the containers are well marked, give them some water, and allow them to grow. Over the next few weeks, you'll know. If there's no apparent difference, your composted manure is likely fine. But if you can see any suspicious difference between the control group and suspect group, you have your answer and likely saved yourself several seasons of frustration. Nice. From the most beautiful gardens like Mohawk to more down-to-earth gardens like yours and mine, simple things that we do up front, plus paying attention to what we do along the way, can pay handsome rewards, like a weedless garden, and help us avoid costly mistakes along the way. If you'd like to learn more about what you saw today, you can get that on our website, and the address, it's the same as our name. It's growingagreenerworld.com. I'm Joe Lample. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for more Growing a Greener World. So this is what a tomato plant looks like after it's been growing in tainted soil. Now these are very susceptible to persistent herbicides. And yes, I knew how to test my soil before I put it in my garden, but I'm like everybody else. I fell victim to the enthusiasm to get my garden started. Now what am I gonna do? Am I gonna dig it all out and start over, or let the microbes do the work? Well, I hope it's the latter, and that's the challenge I'm taking on. But time will tell, and we'll see. You just have to keep watching to find out.